Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. What a wonderful crowd, standing room only. I'm Tomiko Brown-Nagin, the faculty director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. It is so wonderful to see all of you here today to hear a book talk by Richard Rothstein on his book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. It's a book that the New York Times called powerful and disturbing. We at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute are especially proud to host this talk. As you may know, our namesake, the brilliant 1922 graduate of Harvard Law School and architect of the NAACP's legal strategy against segregation, fought tirelessly against residential segregation. In fact, he argued and prevailed in Hurd versus Hodge, which was one of several cases arguing that judicial enforcement of racially restrictive covenants violated both the public policy of our country and the law. Houston won that case in 1948, some 70 years ago, and yet we are still fighting the good fight for housing on a non-discriminatory basis. So our talk today is vitally important. It is the mission of the Houston Institute to keep alive conversations about continuing discrimination in housing and education wherever it exists. And we depend on the generosity of friends like you to ensure that our mission is realized, and we thank you for your support. We also want to direct you to our website for a list of upcoming events that you can enjoy. One final logistical announcement for those of you who may not have heard. There is an overflow room next door with the video feed if you prefer to sit rather than stand. And we apologize that we don't have seats for everyone. We got many RSVPs at the last minute and thus could not accommodate everyone who wanted to be here. But as I say, you can watch the program next door. And now, I present to you Richard Rothstein, who is a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute and also a senior fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Rothstein is a former education columnist at the New York Times, and he's the author of many articles and several books on race and education, including Class in Schools, which I use in my education law course all the time, and Grading Education. You can learn more about Rothstein's work at his webpage at the Economic Policy Institute, and now, without more, I present to you Mr. Rothstein.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown-Nagin, Tomiko. I appreciate your invitation here this morning, and thanks to all of you and to all of you back there somewhere for engaging in this conversation with me this afternoon. As you all know, in the mid-20th century, we resolved that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful to American society, and that it was unconstitutional. Actually, as Professor Brown-Nagin just said, Charles Hamilton Houston began in 1933 a campaign to desegregate education. He started with law schools because he figured that if judges were too stupid to understand anything else, they could figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. And then he went on to challenge segregation in colleges and universities. And as you know, in Brown versus Board of Education, he and his protege, Thurgood Marshall, succeeded in desegregating elementary and secondary education. And then a civil rights movement gained momentum. In the 1960s, we abolished segregation in everything from buses to interstate transportation to lunch counters and water fountains and public accommodations of all kinds. And yet, we have left untouched the biggest segregation of all, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one I've lived in was residentially segregated. There were clearly defined neighborhoods where mostly or all white, and clearly defined neighborhoods which were mostly or all African American. And we all accept this as part of the natural environment. Despite our resolution to desegregate the nation, we accept residential segregation as somehow inevitable, natural, not something we need to do anything about. It's not that we haven't succeeded in doing anything about it, we've never even tried, because we don't think it's the kind of segregation that we spent so many years in the 20th century trying to abolish. And I think the reason that this has been left untouched, that we accept it as part of the natural environment, that we all live in cities that are racially segregated and don't feel compelled to do anything about it, is, well, one is that it's much harder to desegregate neighborhoods than to desegregate water fountains or buses or lunch counters. If we abolish segregation in water fountains, next day you drink out of any water fountain. You abolish segregation in buses, the next day you sit anywhere you want on a bus. The next, you abolish segregation in lunch counters, so you can eat at any restaurant. But if we abolish segregation in residential neighborhoods, the next day things don't look much different. And so we've adopted a rationalization, a national myth, to excuse ourselves from continuing the struggle to desegregate the country, to address residential segregation. It's a myth that's held across the political spectrum. It's not something that's held only by conservatives. It's held by liberals. It's not something that's held only by whites. It's held by African Americans. And we call this myth, we say we have de facto segregation. It's a term we all use. The residential segregation is de facto. It's not de jure. It's not government-sponsored. It's something that just sort of happened by accident. It happened because, people like to live with each other of the same race, or because private homeowners refused to sell to other race buyers, or real estate agents steered families from one race to the other in their private capacity, or maybe banks discriminated, or maybe African Americans just don't have enough income to move into a typical middle-class neighborhood. So all of these private, uncoordinated decisions, not the result of government policy or law or regulation, result in segregation. And that way it's different from all the other kinds of segregations that we've adopted, that we fought against and removed in the 20th century. Well, as you heard, Professor Brown-Nagin said that I used to specialize in education policy. And that was my concern. And as a specialist in education policy, I spent a lot of time documenting the causes of the achievement gap between black and white students. And as you heard, I wrote a book about this called Class and Schools, in which I tried to document the pathways by which specific social and economic disadvantages resulted in lower student achievement. It's not poverty. How much money a child's parents have doesn't automatically translate into lower achievement. But there are so many social and economic characteristics of lower class status, or in the case of African Americans, lower caste status, that directly translate into lower achievement that we need to address if we wanted to close the achievement gap. And I won't go into all of them or many of them now. Just give one example. We know that urban African American children have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle class children. And if a child has asthma, the child is likely to be drowsy or from being awake at night, or sleepless, or even absent from school from not getting any sleep. And if you have 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, except one group of children has asthma at a higher rate than the other, that more asthmatic group is going to have lower average achievement, which doesn't mean that there aren't some asthmatic children who will have higher achievement than typical middle-class healthy children, because there's a distribution of outcomes for every human characteristic. But on average, it's inevitable that a child who's in school less or is more drowsy is going to achieve at a lower level than a child who comes to school regularly and in good health and well rested. And there are so many of these characteristics, whether it's lead poisoning or stress from family insecurity or stress from witnessing violence or the lack of a home in which parents are well educated and use sophisticated vocabulary or lack of access to early childhood education. So many of these things that cause lower achievement. And we had a national policy, as you know, that said that none of these things mattered, that the reason we had an achievement gap was because teachers had low expectations and weren't accountable for their children's performance. So I was arguing against that national theory. And then I came to realize, it took me a while, but I'm a slow learner, and I came to realize that it's one thing if a child comes to school with one of these characteristics and is predicted to have lower average achievement. Maybe the teacher can give that child special attention and the child can do better than the child otherwise would. But when you concentrate children with these kinds of disadvantages in single schools, it's inevitable that the achievement of children in those schools is going to be lower. The schools are overwhelmed with these social and economic problems that children come to school with. You can't get special attention. It's a contradiction to every child. And so when you concentrate children in schools, they're inevitably going to perform at a lower level. And we call schools where you concentrate children with these disadvantages segregated schools. So I became concerned with school segregation. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court case with which those of you who are law students will be familiar. It was a case in which the Supreme Court evaluated a very, very modest school desegregation plan in Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. It was these districts understood that segregating children was interfering with their mission, and so they tried a modest program to desegregate. They had a choice program where children of high school children and their parents could choose which school to go to, but if the choice tended to exacerbate the segregation of the school, that choice would not be honored in favor of the choice of a child who would help to integrate the school. So if you had a school that was almost all white and one place left and a black and a white child both applied, the black child would be given some preference. Trivial program. Most high school students don't want to go to school outside their own neighborhoods, away from their friends, and the cases where you have one place left and you have to choose between a black and a white child couldn't be less frequent. But the Supreme Court said you couldn't do it. It was a violation of the Constitution to have this very, very modest school desegregation plan. And Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the plurality opinion, and he explained that the reason it was a violation was that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, I thought that was a pretty wise observation on his part. I had come to the same conclusion myself. But then he went on, well, and it's true, the schools today are more segregated than they have been at any time in the last 45 years. But then he went on to say that the reason that the neighborhoods in which these schools are located are segregated is not because of government activity, not de jure segregation. It was de facto segregation. He went through all the reasons that I just described, people liking to live with one another and private choices and so forth. And he said, if the government had nothing to do or an insignificant role in creating this segregation, then it would be a violation of the 14th Amendment for the schools to take account of a child's race in making assignments. And I remembered when reading this case about a situation I had read about a long time before in Louisville, Kentucky in the 1950s, one of the cities in which this case was centered. And in this, some of you may know this story. It's not that unwell known. In Louisville, in a suburb called Shively, a white homeowner, a middle-class suburb, had a friend who was an African-American living in Louisville itself, a decorated Navy veteran, a middle-class fellow, good income, who wanted a better home for his family, but nobody would sell one to him. So the white homeowner bought another home in Shively, in this suburb, and resold it to his African-American Navy veteran friend. And a mob surrounded the house when the African-American family moved in. They was protected by the police, the mob. Rocks were thrown through windows. Nobody could be identified by the police as the rock throwers, and it was dynamited and firebombed. And at the end of this riot, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound much like de facto segregation. And I obviously knew a little bit more about it than that, but I never put it all together. And so I began the investigation that led to this book that led me to the conclusion that not just did government have a role in segregating neighborhoods, but that the role was so powerful, the various policies that were followed were so interlocked and systematic that we have not just some isolated government action, but that racial segregation in neighborhoods everywhere in the country is state-sponsored, it's de jure segregation, it's as unconstitutional as segregating water fountains, and as such, we have an obligation as American citizens in this constitutional democracy to do something aggressive to remedy this constitutional violation. So let me spend some minutes describing some of the chief policies that federal, state, and local governments followed to create segregation, policies that were so powerful that they still determine the racial landscape of cities today, and that we have never remedied and don't feel an obligation to remedy because we don't know this history. Let me begin by talking about public housing. Now, I know that we all have an image of public housing. It's a place where poor people live. Lots of mothers with, single mothers with children, young men without hope, acting oppositionally, attracting the attention of the police, not having jobs in the formal economy. That's our image of public housing. That's not how public housing began. Public housing began in this country. Now, I didn't know this until I began this research, so I'm not surprised if you don't, and maybe you're smarter than I am and you do know it. But public housing began in this country during the New Deal as a program for stable, working-class families, mostly white. It was you couldn't be poor and live in public housing. Public housing agencies, for example, here in the Boston area, sent social workers out to the applicants' homes, applicants for public housing, to make sure that their children were well behaved and that their furniture was of high enough quality to maintain the high standards of public housing. It wasn't subsidized. Families in public housing paid the full cost of the housing and their rents. They weren't in public housing because they were poor. They were in public housing because in the Depression, there was no housing available. Housing wasn't being constructed. So there's a housing shortage. The Public Works Administration built public housing everywhere in the country. Well, not everywhere. They didn't go west of the Mississippi River because the federal government didn't think that the country existed west of the Mississippi at that time. I mean, after all, there were no baseball teams west of St. Louis, so it wasn't really part of the country. But they built public housing everywhere east of the Mississippi, and everywhere it was segregated. Frequently, segregating communities that hadn't been segregated before. Now, that may also surprise you, but in the early 20th century, every metropolitan area had integrated neighborhoods. We would be stunned if we were transported back to that period to see what urban areas looked like. They were integrated simply because workers didn't have automobiles. They had to get to work. And most industry was concentrated in downtown areas. So people had to live close enough to their workplaces to walk or perhaps take short streetcar rides. And so if you had factories, a factory district, which employed African Americans and Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants and Jewish immigrants and migrants from rural areas, the workers had to live close enough to work. I'm not suggesting that every other house was a different race, but these were broadly integrated neighborhoods. The great African-American novelist, poet, playwright Langston Hughes wrote an autobiography in which he described growing up in a Cleveland neighborhood, downtown Cleveland neighborhood called the Central Neighborhood of Cleveland. He says his best friend was Polish in high school. He dated a Jewish girl. This was not unusual in the mid to early 20th century. The Public Works Administration, one of the first agencies of the New Deal, demolished integrated housing in that neighborhood to build two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation in urban Cleveland that otherwise had not developed and would not develop. Here in Cambridge, the Public Works Administration demolished integrated housing in the Central Square neighborhood. That neighborhood was about half black and half white in the 1930s. It demolished and built two projects, and maybe some of you are familiar with it. Newtown Court was for whites, and Washington Elms was for African Americans. Clearly segregated projects. It's not that whites happen to like to apply to Newtown Court and African Americans happen to like to apply to Washington Elms. These were two segregated, specifically segregated projects by the federal government that segregated a community that hadn't previously been segregated. The same thing happened in Boston. And in Boston itself, there were, in Mission Hill, the Mission Hill project was built for whites only. Mission Hill East was built for African Americans only. Again, not because whites happened to like Mission Hill and African Americans would rather live in a project that had East at the end of its name. These were clearly segregated projects. One observer wrote a newspaper article in which he described going to the office of these projects, and there were two separate lines of people paying rent. One was all black, the other was all white. He said you could have been in Alabama. This was Boston, Massachusetts. And throughout the country, the federal government segregated housing for working-class families in this way. I'm not suggesting that there were no patterns of segregation in some places where there was a great migration of African Americans during World War I, places like Chicago and Detroit. There were already patterns, very rigid patterns of segregation, but in many parts of the country there were none, and the federal government segregated them. During World War II, the process became even more aggressive. During World War II, there were hundreds of thousands of workers who flocked to centers of defense production to take jobs in the war industries. There had been very few jobs available, as you know, during the Depression. It was World War II that created full employment for the first time since the beginning of the Depression. And there had to be housing made available for those workers. The ships and the tanks and the jeeps and the airplanes could not keep being produced if you couldn't find housing for the workers in these plants. In the book, I describe a project north of Berkeley in California, in Richmond, California. Richmond is a deep water port on the San Francisco Bay, and there were no shipyards, though, there before the war. The Kaiser shipyards were built during the war to turn out Liberty ships, and by the end of the war, there were 100,000 workers working in these shipyards. If you add their families, there are probably an influx of 400,000. At first, the shipyards would only hire whites. When they exhausted the supply of white workers, they had to hire African Americans as well. So there were both African Americans and whites working there. Richmond itself was a small community, 20,000 people, all white. A few African Americans living in the outskirts of Richmond who were related to Pullman car porters, railroads would only hire African Americans for Pullman car porters. And Oakland, near Richmond, was the terminus of the Intercontinental Railroad, so there were a few black families living in the outskirts. Basically, it was a white community, 20,000. The federal government built housing for this influx of workers at the shipyards. They built housing for African Americans along the railroad tracks in the industrial area. It was temporary housing because the city of Richmond announced that any African Americans coming to Richmond to work in the shipyards or other war industries would have to leave the community at the end of World War II when the jobs were ended. And it built housing for the white workers in the more residential areas where the white population was living on the eastern side of the town. This again happened everywhere in the country. Anywhere where there's a war plant, the federal government had to build housing, and it built it on a segregated basis, clearly creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. There were very few African Americans on the West Coast, places like Richmond, before World War II, unlike the East, where there was a great migration during World War I. During World War II, it really began at that time. So this was a policy that segregated communities that otherwise might not have been segregated. In fact, we have an existence proof that demonstrates how unnecessary and this policy was. There was another shipyard in in the San Francisco area, the Marin Ship, it was called, in Marin City, which is on the across the Golden Gate Bridge. And that shipyard grew so rapidly, ramped up so rapidly, that the government had no time to create separate projects for African Americans, whites. At first, they only could take single men because there was no housing for families. So they had barracks, and the workers showed up, and the authorities just handed out pillows and blankets as they came and sent them off to the barracks to the where they were living, and without segregation. These were integrated barracks, and there were no problems. When the families arrived and they built housing, they figured that they might as well build it integrated as well and not worry about segregating. And that was the only integrated housing project for war workers that I know of anywhere in the country. Everywhere else it was segregated, creating, as I say, segregation where it hadn't previously existed. After World War II, there was still an enormous housing shortage in the country. And as I said, no housing really was being built in the Depression. During World War II, it was prohibited to use construction materials for civilian purposes unless it was for workers at defense plants. So there was a backlog of housing needs, and then millions of returning war veterans came back to the country needing a place to live. They were doubling up with relatives. They were living in Quonset huts and open fields. There was a desperate housing shortage. And President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt as president in 1945, proposed a vast expansion of the National Public Housing Program. Again, we're not talking about housing for poor people. We're still talking about housing for working class families, returning war veterans who had jobs in the post-war boom, but for whom no housing was available. And so President Truman proposed a vast expansion of the National Housing Program. Republicans in Congress, conservatives in Congress, wanted to defeat the 1949 National Housing Act that Truman proposed. They wanted to defeat it not for racial reasons, because it was segregated. They had no objection to that. They wanted to defeat it not because they didn't like poor people. This was for working class families. They wanted to defeat it simply because they thought that public housing was socialistic. The government shouldn't be involved in the housing market. The private sector should take care of it. Not that the private sector was taking care of it. And so they came up with a strategy that we know as a poison pill strategy. A poison pill strategy, for those of you, you've heard the term, I assume, some of you. Poison pill strategy is a strategy that opponents of a bill in Congress use. They propose an amendment to the bill which is non-controversial, or at least can gain majority support. When the amendment is attached, though, that changes the character of the entire bill, and it makes the entire bill unpalatable and go down to defeat. So conservatives in Congress, led by the leading conservative at the time, a senator from Ohio, Robert Taft, proposed an amendment to the 1949 National Housing Act that from now on, public housing had to be integrated. No more segregation in public housing, no more racial discrimination in the federal public housing program. It was a cynical amendment, but they were going to vote for it. They assumed that Northern liberals would join them in voting for it. The amendment would pass. And then when the full housing bill came before the House and the Senate, the conservatives would flip and vote against the final housing bill. They would then be joined by Southern Democrats, creating a new majority against the housing bill, and the housing bill would go down to defeat. So liberals in Congress campaigned against the integration amendment. They were led by Hubert Humphrey, who was the leading civil rights advocate in the United States Senate. I imagine some of you remember him, but another was Paul Douglas, a senator from Illinois, who was also a leading liberal in the Senate, campaigned against the integration amendment. They persuaded Northern liberals to vote against the integration amendment. The integration amendment was defeated. Both Northern liberal Democrats and Southern segregationist Democrats voted against the integration amendment. The full bill then came up to the floor as an ongoing segregated program, and it passed. And this vote, 1949, doesn't seem so long ago to me. Maybe some of you young people it seems like, but just yesterday, this 1949 vote against integration in public housing was used by the federal government as its justification for continuing to segregate all federal housing programs for the next 15 years, which takes us into the 1960s. All right, very soon after the National Housing Act was passed as a continuing segregated program, the giant public housing projects around the country that we became familiar with were built. Perhaps Chicago, the Robert Taylor homes, you know those, or Cabrini Green. There's a new book about the history of Cabrini Green that just came out. Or maybe you've heard of the Pruitt-Igoe Towers in St. Louis, another iconic symbol of public housing. Actually, it was two projects. The Pruitt project was for African Americans. The Igoe project was for whites. And very soon after these projects were built, in the early 1950s, a development occurred everywhere in the country. And it was stunning. It rapidly happened. All of a sudden, there were large numbers of vacancies in all the white designated projects and long waiting lists in the African American projects. It's puzzling because these were all projects occupied by working class families who had jobs in the post-war boom. Why did all the vacancies develop in the white projects and all the long waiting lists in the black projects? It was so serious and so conspicuous, untenable, that the federal government and local housing authorities had to open up all the projects to African Americans. You couldn't have two projects near each other, one with long waiting lists and the other with large vacancies. And so all the projects became predominantly African American. At about the same time, for those of you who know your economic history, industry began to leave the cities and go to suburban and rural areas. It no longer, because as the highways were being built, it was no longer necessary to locate plants either near a deep water port or near a railroad terminal, because you could get your materials and ship final products by road, by truck. So industry left the cities. People living in public housing, who are now predominantly African American, had fewer and fewer jobs, good jobs. They became poorer and poorer. Eventually, public housing became a subsidized program in which people did not pay the cost of their housing and rent, and it became the kind of public housing that we think of today as being public housing. It's not how it began. But the real question is, why did all these vacancies occur in the white projects and not in the African American projects? And that's because of another federal program that was designed to segregate the entire white urban population into single-family homes in the suburbs. And this was a racially explicit program to segregate white families out of cities, to get whites to move out of cities into single-family homes in the suburbs. After I finished my book, I was still doing a little bit of research, and I came across in the archives of the Federal Housing Administration a poster it had produced. It showed a young black man being led away in handcuffs, and the headline was, "Escape Crime, Move to the Suburbs." This was a federal government propaganda. During the 1920s, even before the New Deal, the Commerce Department had a propaganda campaign to get whites to move to suburban areas. The Commerce Department actually hired community organizers to go around to white neighborhoods to persuade people to move to suburbs to, quote, avoid racial strife. The propaganda campaign didn't have much effect because working class families couldn't afford to move to single-family homes in the suburbs. It was only when the Federal Housing Administration was established in the New Deal that money was put behind this propaganda campaign. And the Federal Housing Administration, beginning slowly in the 1930s and then ramping up in the 1940s, recruited a cadre of mass production builders to create suburbs for whites only in every community in the country. Before this time, if you wanted to have a single-family home in the suburbs, typically you'd buy some land and hire a contractor to build you a house. There wasn't the kind of mass production that we became familiar with later. But the federal government wanted to move the white population out of cities into suburbs, into single-family homes. So the Federal Housing Administration subsidized the construction of giant suburbs everywhere in the country on a racial basis. The The most famous of these is Levittown, east of New York City, but it's not an exception. There were hundreds and hundreds of these. Some of you may remember hearing a song that Malvina Reynolds wrote. Pete Seeger used to sing it about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky. They all look the same. These were very modest working-class homes south of San Francisco in a community called Daly City. The symbol of suburbanization in the 1950s was the city of Los Angeles, which grew from nothing to a giant collection of suburbs and places like, I don't know if any of you are from Los Angeles. Anybody from Los Angeles? Okay, all right. Good. Places like Lakewood or Westchester on the west side of the city or Panorama City. These were all FHA developed subdivisions for whites only. So a builder like Levitt and Levittown or any of the others that I just mentioned, they could never assemble the capital. Levittown was 17,000 homes. Where was somebody going to develop the capital to buy the land and build 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers? The only way he could do it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting his plans for the development. The plans had to include the materials he was going to use for construction, the architectural design, the layout of the subdivision, and a commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration had a manual, a written manual. This was not an informal process. They had a written manual that was distributed to appraisers across the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders for these subdivisions. The underwriting manual said that a subdivision could only be built for the same racial class. Not that any were built for African Americans, but that was the language it used. It also prohibited the approval of subdivisions that were too close to African American neighborhoods that ran the risk of infiltration by incompatible racial elements. That was the language in the federal underwriting manual. It was written. This was a written policy. And the Federal Housing Administration required builders like Levitt or Henry Dolger with the ticky-tacky houses, or Mark Taper, who built the Lakewood, required these developers to include in the deed of every home a clause that prohibited resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. So this was a racially explicit policy. It succeeded in suburbanizing the white working class population. It resulted in the white population, the white working class population, being mostly located in working class suburbs surrounding cities. The African American population, prohibited from buying these homes, prohibited by federal policy, concentrated in urban areas. And it created what in the 1960s observers weren't hesitant to call a federally created white noose around African American communities everywhere. The consequences of this still resonate with us today. And I don't have time to go into many, many other policies, but I do not want to suggest to you that these two, public housing and Federal Housing Administration subsidization of suburbans, were the only policies that required racial segregation. There were many others. I describe many of them in my book, but the consequences of at least these two were enormous, and they still determine the racial boundaries in cities today. The developments that I've just been describing to you, the working class suburbs around every city in the country, were modest. Levittown was 750 square foot homes. They sold at the time to buyers for $8,000, $9,000 apiece. These were modest homes bought by working class families. My uncle bought into Levittown. He was a returning war veteran. His job was to stock vegetables in a supermarket. These were not homes for affluent people. But the families that bought those homes and got an FHA or VA mortgage could move out of public housing and pay less in their monthly housing costs than they were paying for rent in public housing. That's how enormous the incentive was for white families to do this. They sold for $8,000 to $9,000 apiece. That's roughly today, inflation adjusted, about $90,000 to $100,000. Today, homes in those suburbs sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, depending on the area of the country. The The white families who bought those homes, the white working class families who bought those homes and had jobs in the post-war boom, gained over the next few generations, 2 generations. You can do the arithmetic. You can subtract $100,000 from, they gained $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 in equity, in wealth. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to take care of emergencies. You can weather a bout of unemployment if you have wealth. You can't do so easily if you don't have wealth. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children, who could then use it for down payments for their own homes. Today, nationwide, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. That's also largely a result of federal policy, a segregationist policy in the labor market. I won't go into that now, but if you want, I can answer that in the question period. But 60%, still a gap of African American incomes to 60%. African American wealth is 10% of white wealth on average. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied, never even been addressed. We accept the wealth gap as somehow some inevitability, and that wealth gap determines so many of the social problems that we have in this country today. If it were not for the segregation of low-income African American families into suburbs from which they were into urban areas from which they were prohibited from leaving, we would not be concentrating youth with the kinds of problems that lead to Ferguson's and St. Paul's and Milwaukee's. If it weren't, as I said before, for the concentration of the most disadvantaged children in this country into low-income and low-opportunity communities, we wouldn't have an achievement gap of nearly the extent we have in schools. It affects the lack of mobility of African American families. What economists have demonstrated is that an African American child from a low-income family living in a segregated neighborhood in an urban area has much less of a chance of having middle-class status as an adult than an African American child with the same low income from the same kind of low-income family who lives in a less segregated neighborhood. So it locks in multi-generational low-income status. This is a problem, as I say, that we've never addressed. As you heard and I mentioned, I used to be concerned with education policy primarily, and so it's natural that when I was doing this research, I would look at how we teach this in schools. And I looked at all of the textbooks that are commonly used in American history, high school and middle school classes today. I can say, I don't know what the scientific word for it is, but they all lie about it. This is not being taught. The most commonly used American history textbook in schools, I say today, but maybe it was, I last looked at these 2 or 3 years ago, is something called The Americans. It's 1,200 pages. In that those 1,200 pages, there's one paragraph that's subheaded Discrimination in the North. In that one paragraph, there's a single sentence on housing, and the sentence reads as follows. In the North, African Americans found themselves forced into segregated neighborhoods. That's it. That's all it says. As you heard, I write, it's not the only book I've written other books, and I write lots of articles. I know what publishers do. They spend a lot of money hiring copy editors looking for passive voice sentences. This is one they missed. African Americans woke up one day, they looked out the window, and they said, hey, we're in a segregated neighborhood. Well, this is a crime, because if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than we've learned it, they're going to be in as poor a position to address it as we've been. So one thing I say, I do a lot of speaking about this topic, and one thing I say to everybody is that this is something we can do something about, at least to begin. Every one of us lives in a school district, has children or grandchildren, as the case may be, or aunts or uncles and know in that school district, and you know parents and members of the PTA and school board members and principals and superintendents and teachers, and we can make an issue of this. And we have to learn the history ourselves and then make an issue about how it's being mistaught to our children. And I guarantee you that if we make an issue of how it's being mistaught in the schools, we'll start a conversation in the adult community as well. So that's one simple thing that we can all do about it. As I say, there are many, many other policies that the federal, state, and local governments followed. I'm not going to go into them all, but I'll conclude by giving you one of the most trivial examples that I found. And the reason I want to describe this to you is so you can see how systematic the policies of federal, state, and local governments were. So in the course of doing this research, I happened to be reading through an African-American newspaper in Los Angeles during the 1940s. It was called the California Eagle. And I came across an article about air raid wardens in Culver City, California. Culver City is a suburb of Los Angeles. It was an all-white suburb. It's you may have heard of it because movies are made there. And TV programs are broadcast from there, Culver City. During World War II, there were air raid wardens, both on the east and the west coasts. Their job was to go door to door, telling people to dim their lights or to close their blackout curtains to avoid giving guidance to German on the east coast or Japanese on the west coast, bombers. And the city attorney of Culver City convened a meeting of all the air raid wardens in Culver City and gave out to them blank form restrictive covenants to make sure that everybody in this community had signed a legally enforceable agreement never to sell their home to an African American. Since they were going door to door anyway, why not be efficient and distribute the restrictive covenants as well? So this was at the level of a city attorney. A violation of the 14th Amendment, clearly, acting under the color of law to do this. So the policies were systematic. They were interrelated, they were interlocked, they determine the racial landscape today, and we have never addressed it, made an attempt to address it. We, of course, in the 1968 Fair Housing Act, we prohibited future discrimination. And we didn't add enforcement provisions to the Fair Housing Act until 1988. So really, it's a fairly recent phenomenon. But that only, even if it were enforced, and there's still problems with enforcement, all that would do is prohibit future discrimination, would not undo any of the constitutional violations in the creation of racial segregation in the 20th century, and that's what we need to address. So I'd be glad to take questions or comments, and I appreciate your attention. Yeah. Yes.
I struggled my way through the book and finished it last night. It made me very angry. But you did have some good ideas of things that would be possible.
Let me just say, I will repeat the question for the people back in that next room.
The Section 8, ways that you can fix Section 8.
Okay. Let me just first say, your first comment was reading the book made you angry. And I can understand that, but it made me hopeful. And it made me hopeful because so long as we believe this happened by accident, it's easy to conclude it can only be undone by accident. Once we understand that this is now not a natural phenomenon, but it was something that was engineered by the federal government and by state and local governments, we can imagine equally powerful policies to reverse it. And there are many. So you mentioned just one, and it's one that only affects lower income African Americans. We need policies that address working class African Americans as well, but the Section 8 Voucher Program is a program that subsidizes the rents of the lowest income families so that they can afford to spend no more than 30% of their income on rent and still rent an apartment at the average, or maybe it's the median rent in their local public housing authority region. And that program reinforces racial segregation. It doesn't have to be racially explicit. It doesn't have to, because once we've established these structures, you can build neutral policies on top of them to reinforce it. And the reason it reinforces it is in most places in the country, not in Massachusetts, but in most places in the country, landlords are permitted to discriminate against people who have vouchers. There's the Fair Housing Act prohibits housing discrimination, but the only exception to that is your permitted source of income discrimination. So a landlord doesn't have to say in a middle-class community, I'm not going to rent to you because you're black. The landlord can simply say, I'm not going to rent to you because you have a subsidy from the federal government for your rent. That's one thing that we could easily eliminate. But of course, there still remain problems. The median rent that's calculated is based on the rent in the local jurisdiction, and you can figure this out yourself. If you have the median rent, it's going to be too low to rent in more middle-class communities and actually too high to rent in already segregated communities. So landlords in low-income communities typically exploit the program and charge more than the market would otherwise require, and the rents are too high. So a Section 8 voucher holder is more likely to live in a segregated low-income neighborhood than a family with an equally low income who doesn't have a Section 8 voucher. So that's an easy thing to fix. And let me just say the other program for low-income families is the low-income housing tax credit, which is a subsidy that the Treasury Department gives to builders of low-income housing. And that also reinforces segregation because landlords or developers would rather build in an already segregated community because land is cheaper there. And they don't have to hold 25 community meetings to explain why they're building housing for low-income families in this middle-income community, so it's they don't face opposition. So the low-income housing tax credit program reinforces segregation. That would be so easy to fix, and neither of these programs would cost anything to fix them. We could simply place a priority on granting tax credits to developers who are willing to build projects in higher opportunity communities, places with access to jobs and transportation, and schools where achievement was higher, and so forth. So these are easy reforms to do conceptually, but they're not going to happen unless we have a new civil rights movement that's committed to do it. And that, I'm not suggesting that understanding this history is the only thing we need. Civil rights movements in the past that were successful required more than understanding, but it's a first step, yes.
Thank you for being here today. I am from South Central Los Angeles. I'm from Watts. And so I grew up in the Jordan Downs. And right now, those are up for redevelopment. So they're going to be torn down and brought back up. So they're basically vacating most of the Black and Latino community living in those Jordan Downs and given vouchers, where they're promised that they will have housing after it's redeveloped. What is your perspective on what's going on today in housing policy? Yeah. We're seeing kind of reverse flight. We're seeing a lot of Latino and Black communities in LA. I have people moving to Pocatello, Idaho, moving to North Carolina from the Spanish Harlem. We're seeing a huge change in housing policies. What is your comment on what's happening today?
Yeah. Well, you're referring to a process that's typically called gentrification. One thing we should remember is that it's not a new policy. It went on in the mid-20th century and late 20th century as well, but we had a different name for it. We called it urban renewal. And in both cases, it's the transformation of low-income, segregated, mostly Black neighborhoods into more middle-class communities, and the displacement of the residents who live there. What most housing reformers do in response to gentrification is try to propose requirements that the share of housing in those communities be reserved for the former residents or for low-income families. That's fine, but what's ignored is that even if you preserve the share of housing for low-income families, for the previous residents, and create an integrated community, which would be terrific, even if you did that, you're not addressing the fact that most of the families, as you say, are being displaced. And where are they being displaced to? They're being displaced mostly to new segregated communities. So people wonder, for example, how Ferguson, outside St. Louis, got so much attention a few years ago. How did that become a mostly Black community? It was a suburb. We thought Black people lived in cities, not suburbs. How did Ferguson become? Well, Ferguson became a mostly Black suburb because in the 70s and 80s, even the 60s, St. Louis engaged in gentrification or urban renewal, demolished neighborhoods where African Americans lived in the central city. They built, half a McDonald's sign on the Mississippi River to, indicate the gateway to the West, and they built hospitals and universities in the downtown area, and the suburbs were all restricted. So there was only one place, one place where the displaced families could go. Ferguson, there were a couple of other communities nearby, Jennings, and there's that community called Berkeley, and but just this small arrangement of communities where the families could go. So these became new ghettos to displace the one that was, and the same thing is happening everywhere in the country. So what housing reformers need to do is not only focus on preserving a share of housing for low-income families, but need to deal with the desegregation of the suburbs so that families who are displaced have a chance to go to what I call high-opportunity communities. And if you did that, it would be terrific. That would be integration. Gentrification would be fine. We'd create integrated communities in urban areas, and we'd also be able to create integrated communities in the suburbs. But without that second policy intervention, without abolishing, for example, zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction of even small single-family homes on small lot sizes, without dealing with those issues, with the zoning issues in suburbs, we're simply shifting the low-income minority population from one place to another.
We have time for maybe one quick question.
Okay, sorry. Well, I don't know who. Go ahead. I see your head.
This is kind of a follow-up to that question. In a lot of communities that have historically been created through these racially restrictive segregationist policies like Berkeley or even parts of Cambridge and Somerville, there's strong community opposition to multifamily housing in historically single-family neighborhoods or to new development or densification, often justified based on zoning codes. Do you think we need to rethink the way that we let local communities and residents veto new housing developments in order to tackle this problem?
Yeah, well, I've already rethunk it. Yeah, I think absolutely. This is one of the major impediments. These kinds of zoning is. In my book, I describe how zoning originated as a way of preserving racial segregation after the Supreme Court in 1917 prohibited explicit racial segregation. And yes, we need to abolish the right of local communities to exclude housing that would tend to integrate them. They're phrased in economic terms, but in practice what they do is they preserve arrangements that were created for racial purposes. And so, yes, we do need to abolish those kinds of zoning rules. Thank you very much.
So we want to say that Richard's book is going to be for sale just outside if you're interested. Thank you for coming. We appreciate it.